Hey there, Daniel Fava here, and if you don't know me, I'm the host of the Private Practice Elevation podcast, where I share online marketing strategies and interviews to help private practice owners attract more clients and scale their businesses. The Private Practice Elevation podcast is part of the PsychCraft network of podcasts, and I'm super excited to be a part of this network alongside Gordon and the great work he's doing. If you haven't discovered the Private Practice Elevation podcast yet, you can find it wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love for you to join me as we explore topics like building an effective website for your private practice, search engine optimization, content marketing, and copywriting, as well as my conversations with experienced private practice owners about scaling a practice, outsourcing, team leadership, and all things that will help you elevate your business and create the life you love. Be sure to check us out at privatepracticeelevation.com for resources and content to help you in your online marketing journey.
A little over 15 years ago, when I started my private practice, I had to learn a lot, and most of it the hard way, and I don't think you need to do the same. Hi, I'm Gordon Brewer, a licensed psychotherapist, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast, part of the PsychCraft network of podcasts. Join me in this journey of discovery as we have conversations with other leaders and professionals in both the mental and allied health fields. Join us as we explore both the business and clinical sides of running a private practice. This is episode number 256 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. I'm Gordon Brewer and glad you've joined me in this journey, and welcome to the podcast. And if this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. And if you're coming back for more, glad you're back. And I hope you'll take time to follow the podcast wherever you might be listening to it. So I'm looking forward to you hearing from two of my newest friends, Melissa Teissen and Karen Dyck, and they are the people behind the Thrivival 101 podcast, which is a podcast that is part of the PsychCraft network. And I think you're really going to enjoy our conversation because we're going to kind of do a dive into self-care and maybe even thinking about self-care a little differently. There's been a lot of buzz around self-care over the last few years. I think with the COVID pandemic, it just really changed a lot of our thinking around that. But the other thing too is that that's been a little bit of a theme on this podcast this past year, just around the importance of that and being able to get the support you need and being able to not try to do too much of it alone. And that is something that has been on my radar a lot here lately. But I'm looking forward to you hearing from Melissa and Karen and our conversation. And speaking of support, one of the things that I'd love for you to do is go over and check out the Practice Launch Club. It's an exclusive membership community that I started this past year or during 2022 as a way to give people a sense of community around building their practices. And particularly those folks that are in those newer or beginning stages of starting their practice. That is one of the crucial times to be involved with other people, at least in my mind. And so be sure and check that out by going to practicetherapy.com/launch club. And in that community, you'll not only find the support, but also resources and things that are available through that exclusive membership to help you in building and growing your practice. But the number one thing that I think you'll get from that is community. We meet twice a month to do both office hours and also a focus group where we talk about the different struggles that we're having and getting started. But also there's a private community that's on the Circle platform that is exclusive to the members of the Practice Launch Club, where we can communicate between our meeting times and share problems and wins and successes and all those kinds of things. So I invite you to go over and check it out. And what a better time to get involved in something like this as we we will be starting a new year before we know it, folks. It's 2022 is coming to a close, which is hard to believe. But anyway, check it out, practiceoftherapy.com/launch club. And also, real quickly, before we get to my conversation with Melissa and Karen, I'd love for you to hear from our sponsor of the podcast, TherapyNotes.
Is your practice running like a well-oiled machine? One of the keys to a successful private practice is having the right systems and processes in place to make things run as smoothly as possible. With a powerful, secure, and streamlined system like TherapyNotes, you'll have more time to spend with what matters most, your clients. TherapyNotes is a complete practice management system with everything you need to manage patient records, schedule appointments, meet with patients remotely, create rich documentation, and bill insurance right at your fingertips. Their streamlined software is accessible wherever and whenever you need it. It's the EHR that Gordon uses in his practice. By using TherapyNotes, your clinical records will be secure with less paperwork, which means you can give a much better quality of care. TherapyNotes integrates all aspects of your practice to help you improve patient care. Be sure and check them out today by going to practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes. And be sure to use the promo code GORDON to get 2 months free.
Well, hello, folks, and welcome again to the podcast. And I'm really excited for you all to hear from two of my newest friends. And I've gotten familiar with Melissa and Karen through our newly formed network, the Psychcraft Network. And they have, I will say this, they have truly made our network an international network. So Karen and Melissa, welcome. Tell folks a little bit about yourself. As I start with everyone, if you don't mind, tell us. I know that with two people here, we'll take our time with this, but tell folks a little bit about yourself and how you've landed where you've landed, and about your practices.
Melissa and I actually met when she was doing her residency in Manitoba. I was her supervisor, and we kept in touch over the years. And I guess a few years ago, in a discussion she and I were having about psychology and different ways to use our degrees, we realized that we both really had an interest in self-care and both appreciated some of the challenges that exist for mental health clinicians with regards to self-care, and also in particular for female clinicians. And based on that conversation, Melissa and I, over a period of time, developed Intentional Therapist, which offers a series of resources aimed at helping female mental health clinicians think about self-care a little differently and help them integrate it into their workday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Melissa, what about for you?
I think Karen summarized kind of where this has come from really well, but I suppose just to add, as Karen mentioned, she and I go surprisingly way back at this point, and really just again appreciate how important self-care is to the work that we do, whether female or male mental health clinicians, right? The work that we do, I think, especially throughout the pandemic, has been so clearly highlighted as valuable. And at the same time, there's been so many struggles that many people have faced in the past couple of years. And so whether we realized it or not, we were really stepping into, I think, an area that is just so important. And I think really the time has come for there to be a wider discussion about how we take care of ourselves as mental health clinicians, so that we can continue to be available for all of the people who are seeking our services, in particular these days with all of the challenges people have been facing.
Right. And I know that as we were chatting before we started recording, I know that, we as therapists, we know kind of the stuff. And I think one of maybe our flaws a little bit is that a lot of times we have difficulty applying that in our own, for ourselves and in our own practices. But I know one of the things that you all had mentioned is it just kind of a rethinking of how we do self-care and what that looks like. So you all want to say more about that?
Yeah, so I think for mental health clinicians, whether you're a male or female, I think the initial step that we need to take in order to really appreciate the importance of self-care and how to think about it differently is to really start thinking about really the impact and the influences and why self-care is actually can be more challenging for mental health clinicians. Certainly the framework we have developed comes from an acknowledgement that there's particular hazards that come with our work. There's a student mindset that perhaps never leaves us, right? And some of the qualities that probably helped us get our training and our degrees, like this being overly conscientious and driven and making sacrifices in order to succeed academically. Some of those things never really leave us unless we're quite intentional. And when we continue to carry those into our work setting, it can create some real challenges for us. And I think going along with that is some of the messages we just get through our training. Self-care is talked about, but often just about avoiding burnout. And we think it's much more important to really help clinicians think about what they can do during their workday to actually thrive and not just to avoid burnout. So there's, some unique hazards, there's that student mindset. And we also believe that there's some gender specific messages that influence female mental health clinicians that are important to really be aware of and address in any kind of self-care model.
Yeah. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on just kind of the gender specific kinds of things that you guys are noticing and figuring out as far as your work with other therapists around this whole self-care thing.
Well, and Gordon, we'd love to hear your take on maybe some of the male specific messages that probably create challenges as well. Because I know we've discussed some of this a little bit with some male colleagues, but from the female perspective, definitely one of the big challenges for many women is just how women are socialized in general. So some listeners might be familiar with a book that came out a couple of years ago called Burnout by actually two sisters, Amelia and Emily Nagoski. And they really talk about this idea of what they call the human giver syndrome. And essentially, this is how many women are socialized, right? To be people pleasers, to give to others, to put others' needs first, even just to an expectation to be pretty, to be presentable, right? And excuse me, what happens then is that you just grow up receiving these messages, and maybe not even intentionally, but they're just sort of in the air in some ways. And then we bring these messages of needing to put other people's needs before our own into a profession that essentially is about other people's needs, right? And so then you have women struggling with, right, how do I reconcile my clients have all these needs, but I also have these needs? Well, what many people do is they don't reconcile that. They just put the client's needs first, because even considering putting their own needs at the same level as the client's needs brings up all of these feelings of guilt or shame or just discomfort, because it's really going against what they've been socialized to believe is kind of the role of a woman. And even if somebody isn't fully on board with these more traditional stereotypical notions of what being a woman looks like, there's still going to be people around us who are believing those things. And so that can create challenges as well, because then maybe we look at other people and we think, well, is there something wrong with me that I'm not, putting my clients' needs before my own, or our colleagues, we might be concerned that our colleagues are judging us if we're doing things differently. So all kinds of different challenges can arise, whether we believe these notions or don't believe these notions, but because others around us have been socialized in this way, that can also create challenges as well. So that's definitely one of the pieces, at least in terms of the how women are socialized, that can really create this extra element of difficulty for female mental health clinicians in particular.
Right. And I think I know in just my work with clients, and particularly women, I think that you're right. Those internal messages that are probably not really something that they've really thought about, or it's just there. And being able to, in many ways, give themselves permission to kind of challenge some of those thoughts a little bit. It's interesting, your question, and I was thinking about this as you were talking, Melissa, was, the men's perspective on this. And I do a lot of work with couples, and one of the things that I think we men, as I like to say, we tend to want to be fixers. And there are a lot of times maybe that it gets projected in our relationships and our partners and all of that sort of thing, that particularly, I think, again, it's this, see if I can put this into words so that it's makes sense. I think one of the conflicts that happens in relationships, particularly between men and women, is that, and I'm not to sound sexist in any way, but just painting with a broad brush, is that men expect women to fix things, and so I think there might be some buy-in to that, because I think most men tend to think of problems as, okay, here's a problem in front of me, let's fix it, and then move on to the next thing. And I think what's missing from that is just maybe a bit of the emotional understanding of what that's like internally, because I think, again, not to paint with too broad of a brush, men tend to be less focused on the kind of the emotional impact of things. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that as well. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I actually, if it's okay, Gordon, I'll talk a little bit about where I think some commonalities exist. And it's actually something we were just talking about before we started recording this, right? That I think, folks who are drawn into this profession are often drawn into it for a number of reasons, right? They may have had some experiences growing up where mental health became an interest for a variety of reasons. And likely at some point they were reinforced for their caregiving role. And right, so people go into this career. And I think that would be probably equally applicable for men. But I'm just hypothesizing about that. And so I think where the commonalities can come in for men and women in this profession is that obviously we value, most of us value that caregiving role and being helpful to others. And where it can create a lot of challenges, in addition to just the normal work pressures, is when outside in our personal lives, whether this be for a male or female, where our personal circumstances are also pulling for some of those, right, to fall into that caregiver role. And so I think that's where maybe we've seen some similarities when we've spoken to other men who are in the mental health field and are therapists. So it's, I think there's definitely are some similarities and things that I think men and women in this field can really relate to, and probably are also having some of the same emotional experiences in relation to these pressures.
Yeah. I know one of the things that I have to check myself on quite a bit is that I'm an Enneagram 2, the helper. And so one of the things I have to pull myself back on and remind myself of, and this, if you're familiar with the Enneagram, this is one of the deadly sins of an Enneagram 2, and that is that we think we know what's best for everybody else. And so we want to go in there and fix that and tell, and rescue people and all of that sort of thing. And so, yeah, it's that self-awareness is really important, I think, in all of this.
Yeah, it's such an excellent point, Gordon. Actually, Melissa and I have developed this kind of 4-pillar approach to self-care, and the first pillar we talk about is connection, and we see that in a very broad sense. But part of the connection pillar is connecting with ourselves and really understanding, right, our values, our vulnerabilities, our strengths, and how that's just such a key component as we look forward to putting self-care practices into place that make sense for us personally.
Yeah. So let's to change gears just a little bit. Why don't you all tell us more about kind of this 4-pillar system that you've kind of come up with, of this notion, and tell us about that.
Yeah. So as Karen just mentioned, we call it the 4 C's model. And surprisingly enough, each of the words start with the letter C. So connection is the first pillar. Compassion is the second. Third is courage. And last is creativity. And what we really love about this model is it really helps us, as Karen was saying earlier, think more broadly about how we're attending to our self-care, right? You'll notice there was no mention of a massage or a bubble bath or anything like that in this model description. And it's really because, and again, actually, I should say, not that we can't use bubble baths and massages and whatever else to take care of ourselves, but that, of course, these things are insufficient on their own. And really one of the big reasons, kind of going back to the connection and compassion pieces that we can talk more specifically about, but I just wanted to highlight too, I think, right, one of the reasons that our traditional or more commodified ideas of self-care are insufficient, especially in our roles as helpers, is because I think there's also this thing that happens, and I think it's probably true for both male and female clinicians, in that we, of course, because we're human, we're going to struggle with self-care at times, whether because we're being pulled by other caring responsibilities or just because of our own personalities, but also because we probably don't want anybody to know that we're struggling with our self-care, right? Least of all our colleagues, right? We don't want to be seen as the incompetent one, right? So I think we also really tend to go through this in silence a lot of the time. Not all of the time, thankfully, but a lot of the time I think people do struggle without even telling close colleagues that they're maybe struggling with something. And that's really a big thing that we're hoping to change as well, by really normalizing this and creating a framework that's broader than how we might traditionally think about self-care. So, and this really comes back to those connection and compassion pieces, right? Just knowing that it's okay to struggle, and that probably your colleagues who you think aren't struggling with their self-care probably are having some struggles with their self-care. And so important to be having these conversations. And that's part of the connection pillar. Just connecting with other like-minded clinicians, right? Connecting, as Karen said earlier, with ourselves, connecting with what is it that drew us to this work in the first place, right? Connecting with our values and connecting with new information, right? Like, how can we think about self-care in different ways? How can we understand the impact of our gender socialization, whether as a male or a female, identifying, so that we at least have that awareness of kind of where we're starting from, can make such an important difference in the direction that our self-care can take.
Yes. Yeah, that's just bringing up a lot of things and a lot of thoughts for me, just thinking about, how do we, one of the things that I think a lot of us as therapists, one of the things that we do is we kind of get our clients to be vulnerable with us. And so being able to then being able to do our own work of vulnerability, of being able to share those things. And, that's been, one of the things that people on this podcast have heard a lot from me about is the importance of finding a network or a community of people that allows you to be vulnerable and also that it's safe to be vulnerable with. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point, and is certainly one of the things that Melissa and I are trying to create through Intentional Therapist, is to provide a safe place, whether that's in our online workshops or in our course that we recently launched, is to bring like-minded women together where we can really talk about what makes this difficult and feel validated and supported in going against some of the limiting beliefs that we might have that interfere with us taking care of ourselves.
Right. So in doing this work, what have you all noticed that are kind of common themes for a lot of women in being able to do effective self-care, I guess is maybe a way of saying that.
Yeah, I guess I can start. One thing that's certainly come out in our conversations with the women that we've met so far is that idea that how the gender socialization kind of fits in. And we've heard a number of women say, I don't buy into those beliefs. But if you ask them, do your actions suggest that you buy into those beliefs? And people will often say, I guess it does, right? So intellectually, they don't believe that kind of their sole purpose is to take care of others and that they should be sacrificing their own needs, or that others' needs always come before their own. But when they start really looking at how their day looks and how their schedule looks and how they're spending their time, their actions are actually often quite in line with some of those messages that we've received that that aren't particularly helpful. So I know for me, that's something that has certainly resonated for me and stood out.
Yeah, and I'll. Gordon,
no, go ahead, Melissa. Yeah.
Just to add, I think another really key piece for many of us, and probably really male or female clinicians, but especially the women that we've worked with, interestingly, compassion often tends to be a challenging piece, right? And like you were just saying, we ask our clients to be vulnerable with us all of the time, but sometimes it is really challenging for us to connect with more vulnerable feelings within ourselves. And again, because of having quite often, right, high standards, need for achievement, maybe some perfectionistic tendencies, right? It's very easy to expect a lot out of ourselves and should on ourselves when things aren't going exactly the way we would like them to, right? And so I think many female clinicians in particular often do struggle with not having compassion for their clients, but having compassion for themselves. And that's why compassion is the second pillar of our model, because it's very difficult to make any changes for yourself without some compassion for just these real difficulties of what the nature of mental health work is, without compassion for the reality that we're not always going to have successful outcomes with our clients despite our best efforts, right? That there's a lot of things that are outside of our control. And so really, again, kind of, you'll notice all of the C's kind of interconnect with each other, because then we really, or I should say, having that compassion also then allows us to better connect with why is it that we're doing this work, to better be present with our clients, just connect with that new information, right? It all just circles back.
Yeah. Again, as you were both were talking about this, I think one of the struggles I noticed for myself, and I don't know, again, if this is particularly male or female in the way of thinking about this, but, there's a kind of this meta message that I think a lot of us deal with of we're being too selfish, or we're being too whatever by taking care of ourselves. In other words, it's that meta message of, okay, if I'm neglecting someone else, if I'm neglecting someone else's needs, then that makes me selfish or a bad person in some way. And I think that's a struggle, I think, for a lot of us, is that recognizing that we've got to take care of ourselves in order to be able to help others in the way that we would like to help others.
Absolutely. And I think, one thing Melissa and I have talked about as well is, we really do need to think of ourselves as our tools of our trade. And, if you think of a surgeon using tools that aren't sterilized and aren't, they're rusted, they're not well taken care of, that would never happen, because that is seen as a priority, right? You need to take care of your tools in order to provide good ethical service. Mm-hmm. And, really, mental health clinicians, the same is equally true. And we just need to appreciate, though, that the tools that we bring to work every day are ourselves. And when we are taking care of ourselves, both at work and outside of work, in ways that make sense for us, we're going to be that much better clinicians, and we're really going to be the best version of ourselves, no matter what role we're in.
Right. Yeah, it's one of the things, again, that and I'm sure all of us that are in this field have experienced, is when we are distracted by things outside the therapy room, whether it's stuff going on in our own lives or just things that we're trying to attend to mentally. And it might be something as simple as, okay, I didn't sleep well the night before, or something like that. And where self-care would take care of that, it does make us much better clinicians when we can give our full attention within the therapy session, because we have taken care of our own needs first.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that point, Gordon, of, just a very common experience of maybe having a poor night's sleep, right? And that maybe distracts us from fully being present. And we can just give ourselves permission to maybe take a break during the day, or go to bed earlier that night, or do something to actually respond to that need, instead of kind of pushing through and ignoring that need. Yeah. Right. And I think the reality is, depending on how big or complicated the response is to our need, that can be really, really challenging, right? Taking a 5-minute break maybe isn't so difficult, although some days it maybe is actually pretty difficult, right? But we can probably agree that taking a 5-minute break is going to be probably less difficult to do than taking 2 weeks off of work, right?
Right.
And this is why we really view courage as being another integral piece to really effective and sustainable self-care. And I think this is also really where our model is maybe a bit different than some of the more traditional things we hear about self-care. Because really, we think, at least, truly sustainable and effective self-care is going to be kind of uncomfortable, at least at times, right? Because it's going to mean doing these things that aren't the easy thing to do, right? Doing these things like maybe having a conversation with somebody about changing responsibilities in the home, or having a conversation with an employee, or having a conversation with a client about constantly canceling sessions, right? Any of these things that are really important to do, but don't feel very good in the moment, right? And really do require courage to be willing to look at, why is this important? Why is it worth tolerating that discomfort? What is the potential benefit that can come to me on the other side of that discomfort, right? And I think there's so many ways that courage shows up, even just in our day-to-day work, that we don't necessarily realize is actually requiring courage of us. And I think that's just incredibly valuable as well, to even just notice that and name it and recognize, okay, you know what? We are already doing some courageous things. And maybe at the same time, there's some other things that we also really need to intentionally be courageous about, so that we can just have even more of the kind of life that we want to be having. Or as Karen and I were talking about just earlier today, that doing those things that are going to allow us to have even more of the life that our clients already think that we have, right? So we just really, again, kind of owe it to our clients, so that we can be more present and thus more effective to them, but also really owe it to ourselves to be able to also thrive in our lives, just as we're trying to help our clients to do.
Right. I can't remember where I heard it, but I've always reminded of kind of a quote about growth, and that growth does not occur without discomfort. And I think that's one of the things that I've had to remind myself of a lot of times, is that getting uncomfortable leads to growth. I mean, it's just and it learning to lean into those things.
And it's so interesting too what we've heard from some of the women we've spoken to, and I think Melissa and I personally have noticed for ourselves, where we've realized we need to make some changes at work in order to really support our own wellness. And for some of us, that's meant making a decision to moving away from working with certain clients or certain referral sources. Or changing our hours or raising our fees. We see all of those things as actually really important parts of self-care, and things that feel really, really uncomfortable. But I think without exception, and correct me if I'm wrong, Melissa, when the people who've done those things and leaned into the discomfort, the common experience is, it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought. My clients just kind of went, oh, well, okay, that makes sense, right? And they could understand it. And yet, in our heads, we were just imagining how horrible this is going to be for our clients. And, in some ways, really not giving them credit for being able to be adaptive and accept changes in the work that we do as well. So I think that's really something that's stood out as well. It's often not as bad as we imagine it's going to be. Right.
Yeah. Oh, this is such great stuff. And I know we could talk for hours probably. Well, Karen and Melissa, what sort of maybe closing thoughts might you have? I want to be respectful of your time and that sort of thing.
We'd certainly encourage people, if they're interested in learning more, to go to our website, intentionaltherapist.ca. We have a podcast as well, Thrivival 101. So, please listen to that as well. If you sign up for our newsletter, our free newsletter, there's an ideal workday exercise that you'll receive that can, I think, really be a good stepping stone, first step in thinking about self-care a little differently. Or, Melissa and I were just talking earlier today about another really great first step is actually just having a conversation with a colleague about self-care, and whether that's checking in with them to see how they're doing, and finding someone that you feel safe with in being vulnerable and having some of those really important conversations.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And folks are going to find this really helpful with the resources that you've got there, and hope to have you all back here soon. Well, Well, big thanks to Melissa and Karen for being on the podcast. And as you can tell, they are just wonderful people to get to know. And I'm really appreciating their friendship and our relationship through the Psychcraft Network. They are two gentle souls that I feel privileged to have in my life. Be sure, too, to check out their materials and their resources at The Intentional Therapist, and also through their podcast, the Thrivival 101 podcast. And it is a good one. I've been listening to some episodes here lately, and they have such great, rich interviews with people just around the uniqueness of being women in private practice, but also just around self-care and what that looks like, and in thinking about it a different way. And I think you picked up on that here in this particular episode. So be sure and check them out. And also be sure and check out the other great podcasts in the Psychcraft Network. And you can go to psychcraftnetwork.com. We've got a lot of good content in there and a lot of great people. And I'm really feel privileged to be involved in this network and having all of these colleagues that we're sharing the different resources that we all offer and helping you build your private practice, but also getting the support you need in your private practice. So be sure and check that out. And also, speaking of support, want to remind you of my exclusive membership community called the Practice Launch Club. And particularly if you're in those beginning stages of starting your private practice or getting your practice up and running, or if you've already started your practice and want to get some extra support and have a community of like-minded people that are in similar stages of starting their practices, that is exactly what the Practice Launch Club is there for. So be sure and check it out by going to practiceoftherapy.com/launch club. And again, before we close out, big thanks to our sponsor of the podcast, TherapyNotes. And you can find out more about them by going to practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes. And be sure and use the promo code just Gordon, Gordon, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. They're who I use in my practice, and absolutely I'm thrilled that they are a sponsor of this podcast because they have a product and a platform that I can absolutely stand behind. So be sure and check it out. And as I mentioned at the beginning, be sure and follow this podcast and leave us a review wherever you might be listening to it. Love getting honest feedback about the podcast. And be sure and reach out to me with your questions. And also, if there's some topics you would like to maybe hear on the podcast that you've not found yet, let me know. And that'll give me kind of a heads up about maybe some other potential guests and who we can get on here to help you in your private practice journey. So take care, folks. Hope you have a good rest of your week or weekend whenever you're listening to this. You've been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, part of the Psychcraft Network of podcasts. You can find out more about the other great podcasts in the network by visiting psychcraftnetwork.com. And if you haven't done so already, please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com and get your free private practice startup guide, along with a lot of other great resources and webinars and free things just by visiting. Also, be sure to follow us wherever you might be listening to your podcasts. This podcast is intended to be educational in purpose and is not intended to give legal, accounting, or counseling advice. If you need a professional, find the right person for that.